After separation from Lot, Abram remained in the lands of Canaan, near the great oak of Mamre, in Hebron. The land around him was immersed in silence, a marked contrast to the tumult and bustle of the previous days. It was twilight, and the sky was painted with colors that announced the end of another day, but also, for Abram, the beginning of a new chapter in his relationship with God. In this moment of solitude, Abram's heart was heavy but expectant. Separation from Lot, his longtime companion, left a void in his life, a break from the constant company and conversations they shared. Yet in the stillness of this void, Abram found a space for reflection and prayer, a place where the worries of the world melted away, and only the voice of God could fill the silence. It was in this scenario of introspection and spiritual search that God chose to speak to Abram again. The voice of God, as familiar as it was surprising, echoed not only in the space around Abram, but in his very being, piercing the layers of doubt and uncertainty that had begun to form. "Lift up your eyes, Abram," said the Lord, "and look from the place where you are." God instructed Abram to look in all directions, north, south, east, and west. The land that his eyes saw, God promised, would be given to him and his descendants forever. This promise, vaster and more comprehensive than before, not only reaffirmed God's commitment to Abram, but also expanded Abram's vision of his own place in the divine plan. Faced with this expanded promise, Abram's heart was filled with renewed faith. The loneliness and silence that had previously weighed on him were now transformed into sources of strength and clarity. He understood that despite Lot's separation and the challenges he faced, God was with him, guiding him and shaping the future not only of his own life, but of generations yet to come. With revived faith and a heart full of gratitude, Abram responded to God's call in a tangible way. He chose a place in Hebron where God's words had reached his heart, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Each stone placed on this altar was a testimony of his faith, a physical symbol of his covenant with God, and an eternal reminder of the promise that had been made. This moment of communion with God in Hebron was not just a turning point for Abram, it was the beginning of a legacy that would transcend his own existence. The faith demonstrated by Abram, his obedience, and his response to the divine promise would become the foundation upon which the nation of Israel would be built. In this place, before this altar, Abram was not alone. He was accompanied by the presence of God and surrounded by a cloud of future witnesses, all part of the vast divine plan revealed in God's renewed promise. In the vast lands that stretched around Hebron, God revealed to Abram a future beyond anything he could imagine. It was a moment of divine communion, a sacred encounter that would redefine the course of history. While Abram was still absorbing God's opening words, urging him to look beyond the immediate horizon, the voice of the Lord echoed once more, promising not only the land in his eyes, but offspring as innumerable as the stars in the sky. This was not just a reinforcement of the promise made years before. It was an expansion that transcended human limitations of understanding. Abram, faced with the magnitude of this promise, felt small, a mere mortal in the face of the eternity promised by God. However, it was not fear or doubt that filled his heart, but a deep and all-encompassing faith. He knew that God's promise was not tied to the human ability to accomplish, but to the divine power to accomplish what seemed impossible. God's words to Abram not only promised vast descendants, but also reaffirmed the gift of the land as an eternal home for those descendants. It was a promise that covered not only Abram's life, but the existence of future generations. This renewed promise served as a beacon of hope, illuminating Abram's path with the certainty that his faith and obedience would have a lasting impact. Motivated by God's promise, Abram made the decision to build an altar in Hebron, an act of faith and worship. Each stone placed on this altar represented not only his devotion to God, but also his confidence in the promise that his descendants would possess that land. This altar became a tangible symbol of the covenant between God and Abram, an eternal reminder that God's promises are infallible. In the stillness that followed the construction of the altar, Abram reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From his departure from Ur to his separation from Lot, each step was permeated by the divine presence, guiding him through challenges and uncertainties. God's expanded promise reinforced Abram's conviction that true faith requires not just believing in the seen, but trusting the unseen. The expansion of the divine promise to Abram meant not just a personal blessing, but the establishment of a legacy of faith. Abram realized that his story would be told for generations, a testimony to God's faithfulness and the human response of unshakable faith. This legacy, begun in Hebron, would serve as a foundation for the nation of Israel and a sign to all the nations of the earth about the power of faith in God. After receiving God's expanded promise, Abram finds himself on the threshold of a new dawn in his life. The vastness of the land of Canaan before him is no longer just a physical promise, but a potent symbol of God's eternal commitment. At this critical moment, Abram's faith, which had been his compass since he left Ur, is once again called to a new level. God's promise requires from Abram not just belief, but an active response of faith. This faith is not passive. It is a faith that builds, that acts, that sacrifices. Abram understands that his response to God's promise should reflect the depth of his trust in the Lord. In Hebron, a land now promised to his innumerable descendants, Abram chooses to build an altar to God. This altar is more than a stone structure. It is a physical manifesto of Abram's faith, a tangible response to the divine promise. Each stone placed by Abram on the altar is loaded with meaning, representing each moment of doubt overcome by faith, each challenge overcome by trust in God. Abram's construction of the altar in Hebron is also an act of worship, an acknowledgement of God's sovereignty and goodness. Abram, by raising the altar, reaffirms his commitment to God, dedicating not only the land in which he finds himself, but also his own life and that of his future descendants to the service of the Lord. For Abram, God's promise becomes the foundation of his identity and mission. He is no longer just a wanderer in search of land. He is the bearer of a divine promise, the patriarch of a nation that would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. This new understanding of his identity strengthens Abram and prepares him for the journeys and challenges that are yet to come. The renewed promise expands Abram's vision, not only in terms of the vastness of the promised land, but also the impact his faith will have on future generations. Abram begins to understand that his journey with God is part of a larger plan, a story of redemption that would unfold through the centuries. Abram, by responding to God's promise with the construction of the altar, establishes a legacy of faith that would transcend his own life. This legacy would be a beacon for his descendants, a living demonstration that true blessing comes from obedience and trust in God, regardless of circumstances. After separation from Lot on a peaceful afternoon under the blue sky of Canaan, God appears to Abram in a vision that promises to forever change the course of his life and the history of many. Divine communication, loaded with meaning and promise, establishes a new level in Abram's journey of faith. God calls Abram to look beyond the immediate to the vast and unexplored horizon. Look north, south, east, and west, God instructs, each direction symbolizing not only territorial expansion, but also the spread of Abram's influence and blessing over the land. God's promise is clear and expansive. The land that Abram sees will be given to him and his descendants, an eternal promise that extends far beyond the reach of human vision. God does not simply reaffirm the gift of the earth, he expands the promise, assuring Abram of countless descendants, like the stars of the sky or the dust of the earth. Abram's response to this renewed promise is an act of profound faith. He understands that God's words transcend immediate reality and touch the future, shaping not only his life, but also the destiny of future generations. Abram, although still without a son, firmly believes in God's promise, a faith that is credited to him as righteousness. Moved by unshakable faith and deep gratitude, Abram builds an altar in Hebron, in the same place where God spoke to him. This altar serves as a physical and spiritual marker of the covenant between God and Abram, a symbol of the divine promise that will be honored throughout the ages. The choice of Hebron, a place of meaning and promise, highlights Abram's continued faith in God. Each stone on the altar represents a testimony of Abram's faithfulness, a tangible affirmation of his willingness to follow the path that God has marked out for him, regardless of the uncertainties or challenges that may arise. The renewed promise to Abram in Hebron is not only a guarantee of personal blessing, but also the establishment of a people that will be formed from his descendants. These people, born of faith and promise, are destined to be a light to the nations, a source of blessing to the entire world. God's promise embodies a vision of redemption and purpose that transcends national and temporal boundaries. Abram, reflecting on the magnitude of God's promise, he looks to the future not only with hope, but with the assurance that his faith and obedience have a greater divine purpose than he can fully understand. The construction of the altar in Hebron is a gesture of faith that will resonate through generations, inspiring those who seek to understand and live according to God's will. Abram, now in Hebron, lives a moment of deep reflection and action. The divine call to settle in this place is not just an invitation to occupy a physical space, but a gesture that symbolizes the consolidation of your faith and the materialization of God's promise. Hebron, with its rolling hills and fertile valleys, becomes the setting where the relationship between God and Abram reaches new depth. Hebron represents more than a geographic location for Abram. It is the place where your faith will be tested and your promise renewed. The land, promised in the not-so-distant past, now stretches before your eyes, a vast tapestry of future possibilities and promises. Abram walks the land, each step an act of faith, each breath a silent prayer of gratitude. In response to the divine promise, Abram decides to build an altar in Hebron, an act of worship and submission to the God who guided him to this point. The construction process is meditative, almost ceremonial. Each stone chosen for the altar carries with it symbolic weight, representing the many trials and triumphs of your journey thus far. This altar is more than a physical landmark. It is a link between the divine and the earthly, between the promise and its fulfillment. As the altar takes shape, Abram reflects on the nature of the promise made to him. This is not a promise of earthly riches or temporal achievements, but a promise of legacy, offspring, and lasting impact. God's promise transcends Abram's life, extending to future generations, to a people not yet born who will carry the torch of their faith. Abram's stay in Hebron and the construction of the altar are testaments to his unshakable faith, a faith that grew and deepened throughout his journey. He recognizes that God's faithfulness knows no bounds, that the divine promise is as vast as the starry sky under which he once looked up in wonder and belief. Abram's story in Hebron is not just the final chapter of his personal journey, but the prologue of a larger story that encompasses nations, kings, and prophets. Abrams' faith, crystallized in the construction of the altar in Hebron, lays the foundation for the development of a deep relationship between God and the people of Israel. This place becomes an eternal symbol of God's commitment to his people, a reminder that true faith requires trust and obedience. Abram, looking at the completed altar, feels a peace that transcends human understanding. He knows that his journey, marked by doubts, mistakes, and revelations, was guided by a divine hand. In Hebron, before the altar of God, Abram is not alone. He is surrounded by the palpable presence of God, assured that his faith and his offspring will be a blessing to all the nations of the earth for generations to come.